Hello and welcome to the Cloud Chronicles. I'm Joey D'Antoni and I'm here with my colleague John Morehouse. And
Hello.
this is the start of a big topic. We're going to do a big series on this. It's probably going to be around 10 episodes. And you'll note it just says part one on the slide. I don't want to commit that it's only 10 because it might be more. Um,
It'll be more.
yeah, it probably will be more because networking is a big topic in the cloud and in Azure. So we're gonna do a lot of demos in this. We're gonna talk through a lot of things. I'm Joey D'Antoni. I'm principal cloud architect at DesignMind. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and my claim to fame on this topic is that I built an always-on availability group that was running on my laptop and in Azure in 2013, which is pretty much the hardest thing I ever did in technology. I'll let John introduce himself.
Hi, I'm John Morehouse. I'm a principal consultant with D'Antoni and Associates. I too am also a data platform MVP from Microsoft. I do not have a claim to fame with Azure networking. Oh, well, I guess my claim to fame just currently was setting up private endpoints for a recovery services vault. That's probably my one low claim to fame. It's not as good as Joey's, but it's a claim to fame.
Yeah, and private endpoints and even Azure networking in general are really kind of an interesting topic because the history of the cloud, per se, is that uh, we did everything in the very early days of the cloud. We'll call it like 2009 to 2013. Everything was just public because, like, why would you ever want private networking in the
Mhm.
cloud, right? Like, what is security anyway?
Yeah,
Uh,
security is irrelevant.
well, but it's funny because if you think back to a lot of the early cloud services, they were really just standalone services. So you think about like Amazon S3 storage, which was really just the standalone place to put files for your website, kinda, or images or things like that, or even the Q services, which were early. And then on the Microsoft side, the first couple of services were SQL Azure, which was really a standalone database, which was kind of designed around. Well, the early SQL Azure was kind of a mess, but I think it was designed around just being data storage for Windows Azure, which was almost like it wasn't, but it was an early incarnation of a combination of like containers and app services, which was the goal for Windows Azure. So where this all changed, and I remember the timeline pretty well, at least on the Microsoft side, and less so on the Amazon side. In 2012, Microsoft introduced the concept of VMs, and once you had VMs, if you wanted VMs to talk to other VMs, you needed networking. Uh, so that concept quickly came into play and it evolved pretty quickly. Like it was pretty terrible at first. Uh, so Azure networking does a whole lot of things. I think I was telling you, John, Azure has these resource providers, right? And so they kind of roughly map back to PowerShell. But let me just share my screen again so we can talk about like what a resource provider is just at a high level. Sorry, slow
I
with the
will
web
I will
buttons
say while
here.
Joey's getting his screen ready that learning Azure networking or even cloud networking in general has really progressed. I think my technical skills and abilities and help progress my career because we all know that cloud's just a fad. It's going to go away eventually. Just kidding, it's not. Uh, so even as a DBA, learning networking skills has helped me help my clients.
Yeah, for sure. It's the most important part of cloud,
Yeah, I'd
by
agree.
a lot. So one of the
Yep.
things I always tell customers, whether they're doing a migration or a new project, is let's design the network first because you're gonna have to understand that before you understand anything else. So one of the things I was talking about was resource providers, and this is just a URL to a virtual network in my Azure portal. Microsoft Network is the resource provider for networking. And the reason why I'm highlighting that is what I thought we were going to do as like a slide or an intro for this was to I, with the PowerShell commandlets, you can grab all the like things in Azure that are
Mhm.
associated with that networking provider. Well, it turned out with AZ Network there are like 125 things, uh, give or take 5 or 10. I don't remember the exact number, but I was like, that's not going to fit on a slide. So that's part of the reason why this is going to be 10 parts because networking in the cloud is pretty complicated. There's a lot of steps. At its basic level, it's just like networking. It's kind of just like your home network, but we're going to talk about how it works in a hybrid fashion. Our first like subtopic is going to be on VPNs and express routes. But we'll also talk about the way things like routing work in this series, how you define hybrid networks, and all kinds of things like that. Uh, what was your so aside from private link aside, which we'll also talk about a little bit later, that's how you provide private networks for PaaS services. What other challenges have you faced in trying to learn cloud networking, John?
I think one of the other challenges that I learned was just the overall concept of like, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but like the difference between like hub and spoke and the different ways that you can lay out things. And we haven't gone through it yet, but like
Hmm.
how you can lay out the VNets and the subnets. And it really takes some forward thinking. We had an engagement where we actually had to lay out, there's a client you and I worked on that we had to get Denny involved and lay out that network because it was going to be
Hmm.
so complex and lay out the VNets and the subnets and the NSGs, the network security groups. Sorry. But really learning how to think forward on where everything's going to play. Right. I think that has been a really hard thing for me to overcome because it's not as simple as your home network for me. My home network
Yeah.
is just my my one router that I have. Right.
Yeah, I always like to say flat networks are bad because if, for example, if you can remote desktop from your desktop to a domain controller, so can the attacker who phished you.
That's bad.
Uh,
Yeah.
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 So that brings up a good point. Let's introduce we've kind of broken this down into a couple of slides. So let's introduce the kind of core components of Azure networking, and this is going to be at a very high level. Um, So let's just kind of talk about what these core components are. And we're going to dive in a little bit deeper, and then we're going to do some demos and build some stuff out so you can kind of see this. I think the most foundational concept of Azure networking is the virtual network.
Yep.
Uh,
Agreed.
that's the core. The virtual network is made up of all of these things, and we'll talk through them in a minute. But there are also some core principles I want to talk about. A virtual network can only be in one region in one subscription. Uh, One of the things we always like to talk about here is billing and cost, and we're going to talk about that throughout this series. One of the nice things about virtual networks is that they have no inherent costs, so there's no like you don't pay like $5 a month for a virtual network or anything like that. But you do pay for traffic that flows between virtual networks, between regions, data that flows out of Azure, those are all metered. And I haven't had too many customers complain about this stuff in Azure, but it tends to be a much bigger thing in AWS. Uh, but that is something to keep in mind. So, like from a cost perspective, your ideal architecture might be to have one pretty big virtual network in each region. But it doesn't. It's never going to work out that way in practicality. You're going to have probably multiple networks per region, and especially if you're in an environment where you have multiple subscriptions, you're going to need virtual networks too because they can only be tied to a subscription. Within a virtual network, we break things down into subnets. Can you tell me a little bit more about subnets, Sean?
Sure. Subnets are basically a smaller container underneath the VNet, if you will. A good example is we might create a virtual network that spans a large number of IP addresses, and we talk about in the next thing here about address space. But that block might be 65,000 IP addresses. We essentially carve out the subnet underneath that into smaller segments for like maybe SQL. Maybe SQL has its own subnet where SQL servers are going to live, and they're going to get IP addresses from that subnet. That helps us to segregate and categorize different address spaces within that virtual network itself.
Yeah, and that's also it's a security thing too. It's not
That too.
potentially, and you can see we have network security groups in the bottom of the screen, which is kind of the most rudimentary way we can do networking. There's also firewalls of all kinds, but like with that SQL example John mentioned, you might only allow traffic inbound on 1433 into port 1433 into a SQL subnet. Uh, you might even have a subnet where you like have a public access subnet. So
Mm-hmm.
you have like a public load balancer. And throughout this series, we'll be talking about the difference between public and private IP addresses. One of my biggest pet peeves in Azure is that if you build a new VM in the portal and you click next, 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 by default, it gives you a public IP address with port 3389 open
It's
to the
so
internet.
frustrating.
Yeah, like it's really handy for demos because you can RDP into your VM, but it's really bad security. Most of your resources shouldn't have public IPs, only the ones you want to have public IPs are. The other aspect we have here is the address space, like John mentioned. This is kind of key to planning. if you've ever worked with an experienced network engineer, uh, I was joking with a colleague about this because I think Azure recently introduced, and I can't remember what it's called, but like an IP address management solution. Um,
Hmm.
and Amazon's had one for a while. And I joked with both Denny and a colleague and a client. It's like, wait, I thought everybody used Excel for that because like every network engineer that I've ever worked with has like this Excel spreadsheet that has the entire map of IP address ranges in the company, and that's how they manage it. The key here is we're going to talk about a concept called peering throughout this, where you can join virtual networks without a VPN. You can do that across subscription. You can even do it cross-tenant with certain approvals, but you can't peer networks that have overlapping IP address spaces within them. So it's important to kind of plan those out and lay out those IP addresses. That's the crux of address space. Uh, virtual NICs, virtual NICs are a dedicated Azure resource. It's kind of interesting when you create a VM. One of the things you'll see is it's made up of not just the VM, but the VM, the OS drive, the virtual NIC, any data drives you have associated with it, and depending on the type of VM, you may have another resource or two that are associated with it. But that virtual NIC has its IP address mapped, and it's associated with that VM. So, like, if you wanted to re-IP a VM or assign a VM to another network, what you would have to do would be, assign a different virtual NIC to it, and that's something else to keep in mind.
I think it's also
User-defined route. Go ahead.
the virtual NICs are also used for other services where you
Mhm.
do want to do like private endpoint. There's actually
Mhm.
a virtual NIC that gets assigned to those resources as well. So virtual NICs aren't just for VMs; they're kind of spread
Yeah,
out through the infrastructure for various networking things. Right?
yeah, that's a really good point. Have you worked with user-defined routes at all?
Very briefly, I find that if I have to use a user defined route that's very edge case, very specific need for that, most
Yeah,
of the clients I interact with, we don't have. I can only think of one that might have user defined routes, but typically I don't mess with the routing tables.
so the common pattern for user-defined routes, and there is a static way that Azure routes traffic, and it's usually VNet to VNet, and then VNet to Azure, then VNet to Internet. The most common use case for user-defined routes ties us into that third bullet on the left with firewalls there. So if you're using an Azure firewall, or if you're using a third-party firewall, the architecture there is the same. You're going to define a user-defined route to route traffic through that firewall and then route back the way you want it. That's really the kind of use case there. DNS, it's always DNS, right? Uh,
Always DNS.
I kind of spent like most of my yesterday dealing with DNS problems in Kubernetes, and not problems, but teaching DNS and Kubernetes to some developers. So that was fun. Uh, yeah, DNS is kind of interesting here because Azure does provide DNS for you natively. There's also private DNS. We're going to have a whole talk on DNS, but the key thing I want you to take away from this is let's pop back over to my virtual network since I have that up and running.
DNS is probably my other thing that was difficult for me to just comprehend of the various DNS services that Azure offers and like where all those DNS because a lot of places, a lot of organizations have a DNS server on premises, right?
Yeah,
And
so
you have
this
to
is
make
my
sure
core.
everything talks to each other, and
This
that
is my
getting that through my head was difficult.
Yeah, this is my core VNet. I think I only had a domain controller in it at the time. But here I'm using custom DNS, which means I'm providing the DNS services. 10.0.3.4 is my domain controller. Don't do what I do. You should always have multiple DNS servers. I'm being cheap here and just saving some money. You can also use Azure DNS. You can pay for that. You can kind of use it by default. Uh, and for really simple configs, you're probably just going to point at your domain controller. We're going to talk in our next session on VPNs and stuff. One of the first things you should do after you have a VPN in place is if you're planning on using your domain controllers for DNS, is get domain controllers in Azure so you have that DNS available
At
in
least
case your
two.
VPN goes down.
At least two.
At least two. Yeah.
At least two, and make sure they're in different availability zones or regions.
Yeah.
But at least two.
Yeah. Have a plan there because or use Azure DNS. Azure DNS
Yep.
is going to be relatively expensive on the scheme of things. Uh, let's just talk through a few of these other services at a high level. Uh, I'll let you run with load balancers because there are like 55 of them, and I know you're studying for the networking exam.
I am studying for the networking. And this is actually one of the differences between like load balancers and front door, and the various components is sometimes mind-boggling to me. So I am studying them. But essentially the load balancer, and we used to have load balancers on premises, right? The load balancer would have a front end access point, usually an IP address, and would route traffic based off the workload or some signal to specific hosts on the back end. So there's a back end pool that you might have, let's say two or three virtual machines serving a web app. You can direct traffic between the three web app servers to help load balance the actual workload and traffic itself. And so you could do load balancing in Azure.
Yeah, and there are a bunch of services for this.
There are.
Like if you're a DBA and you've built an availability group, you may have used an internal load balancer, which I think are just called load balancers now. That's the most basic one. But there are app gateways which can balance load across within a region. John mentioned front door. Front door is just app gateway kind of across region. There's also traffic manager. There are also third-party load balancers. We're going to try to not focus too much on third-party tools, except for firewalls, which are a lot more common. Uh, but they all kind of conceptually they all do the same thing. There's a health probe, it checks state. You have a way of telling it how you want traffic routed, whether that be round robin or geographically. Uh, Traffic manager is pretty cool like that. Uh, and they all route at different levels of the networking OCI stack, which we're not going to cover, but you may hear us say level 5 or level 7 a couple of times. You can Google that. We're not that hardcore of networking like other people on John's team. But those load balancers operate at different levels of the stack as to where your application communicates. Next, we have the most overwrought term, possibly the most overwrought term in all of Microsoft computing, gateways. Uh, Gateways are the new DAC, John. Discuss.
Everybody gets a gateway.
Yeah.
Gateway this, gateway that.
So there are gateways in Fabric, there are gateways in Azure networking, there are other gateways.
There's the self-hosted integration runtime
gateway.
That's a gateway.
Yeah.
There's virtual gateways.
In general, I'm going to try to talk in generalities because they're sort of true. A gateway is some kind of service that sits on the edge of a public network and does a private to public transfer. These may integrate with a VPN, they may not. In a lot of cases, you're using a gateway when you don't have a VPN in place. But to add controversy here, VPNs require a gateway. So that's kind of I don't know if there's an official definition of a gateway, but loosely defined, they're kind of converting public traffic into private traffic. Nearly in almost every gateway I can think of, that's effectively what's going on there. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about NSGs?
Yeah, real quick though, back to gateways.
Yeah.
So do you classify the web application firewall within a gateway as a firewall or part of the gateway?
It's part of the key functionality of an application gateway.
Yes.
Which is going to be which is a type of load balancer, which is going to be another topic.
Interesting question.
It's a firewall and a gateway, and I think they sell the firewall as like its own service.
They do.
I don't remember. Yeah.
Yeah, they do. They do.
Yeah.
And that's one of the components of like these services that I always get confused. Like, well, do we use a firewall or do we use a web application firewall? And sometimes it gets really crazy. But network security groups, we usually call them as NSGs. So if you hear the term NSGs, that usually refers to a network security group. At least in my world is when I talk about them. And we kind of talked about like the security between subnets, and Joey kind of alluded to it. We can use network security groups to control traffic inbound and outbound between virtual networks and subnets. So like Joey mentioned, if we had a SQL Server subnet that was serving IP addresses for SQL Server instances, we could block any traffic that wasn't on 1433 to that subnet using a network security group. You will find that network security groups can get confusing. At least they do for me sometimes. And can get pretty intense. Like they can get pretty well convoluted and where's the NSGs located? What are they doing? Who's blocking what? And there's
So I
different
know we said
level.
we were going to talk too much about cost in this episode, but I will bring up cost here. Network security groups are free as in beer. There is no cost associated with network security groups. They are very manual. Like you have to define ports and IP ranges, and I don't think you can use DNS names. Uh, so it's a very manual effort, and this is where firewalls come in at scale, and you pay for the firewall services. That's kind of the main difference there. Um, so just keep that in mind as we go forward. So a lot of things that we're going to talk about throughout this series about networking, there's going to be a like cheaper option and there's going to be a more expensive option. Like the next one's going to be about VPNs, and we're going to talk about ExpressRoute, and ExpressRoute can do all this magic. It also costs like my house a month if you have enough
Bring me,
bandwidth. Uh,
bring me your wallet.
yeah, VPNs cost like $100, or I think the cheapest VPN's like $35 a month. Uh, so you're going to run into this in a lot of places. So it's important to understand the decision points, the trade-offs. Like if you're building a big enterprise network, I would not try to do it with NSGs unless you had the
No.
most magical PowerShell scripters in the world working for you. And I don't think Rob works for you. Because like you'd want to automate a bunch of stuff. Whereas with firewalls, you can put predictive behavior in and you can make it a lot smarter, but you're going to pay for that service. So that's kind of the key thing to understand there. Let me,
This is
I'm trying
definitely a
to.
high level overview as to, and not anywhere close to all encompassing.
Yeah, for sure.
I
Like
mean,
it's
like this is like one of the big behemoths of Azure that
yeah,
you have to tackle.
networking and like there is like we talked about. There's a whole exam called AZ 700 that's dedicated to the concept of networking. It comes up in like every almost every subject, right? Because networking is really foundational for security, foundational for how you make things talk. That's really important. One kind of interesting thing about networking, I think, in Azure, John, that we probably haven't spent any time on, and we're getting towards the end here a little bit, is Azure's global network. Microsoft has a little bit of bandwidth, don't they?
Just a little bit. I don't remember. I don't remember how many teraflops. Like, what's their back end, their
Yeah,
backbone? Like,
it's insane. It's called
yeah, it's crazy.
yeah, yeah. I mean, so I used to work at Comcast, and we had this crazy like the main Comcast core network was insane, and I thought we had a lot of bandwidth. Uh, the amount of backhaul bandwidth Microsoft has between these regions and data centers is just otherworldly. Uh, like when you're building cross oceanic fiber optic runs, so that you have more networking, it's pretty insane. So they've made huge investments just in the amount of backhaul bandwidth they have. So it's kind of an interesting thing because it's a little bit out of networking, but every Azure service you use is going to have a fixed amount of bandwidth associated with it because Microsoft needs to be able to understand how much bandwidth they're going to have. But in general, your network latency is going to be kind of best in class uh, for the amount of bandwidth you have. Of course, you can always saturate that. Like if you're trying to, force down huge amounts of bandwidth, uh, you're going to get backed up. But the latency between sites is unreal. And I think the other thing we should mention is just regional capacity. Like how many of your customers before the cloud had like more than two data centers?
Most of my clients have at least two data centers, but most of the time those data centers are like 6 blocks down the road.
Yeah, yeah. And like pre-cloud or pre-cloud, like now, if you wanted to spin up capacity in say Southeast Asia, you had to like send somebody to Southeast Asia, or
Yeah.
maybe you had a provider like Equinix, but you still, had to get hardware there and stuff. Cloud really changes all that. Uh,
Well, and that,
I want to do a real simple demo as we approach our time, just because we're going to kind of do as we run through this series, we're going to keep this kind of static network up in place, and I want to get started and go ahead and build it. And all we're going to do here is build a virtual network, uh, and I'll show you the resource. So we're going to go to the marketplace. In the nice here, you can see virtual network gateway, another type of network, and local network gateway. So
gateway
I'm
should
going
be
to
on a
use the
bingo
best.
card somewhere.
I'm going to use the best practices for naming per Microsoft, and this is a discussion John and I had the other day.
We've had several times actually.
Yeah, yeah. So you'll notice I'm calling this VNet East US Demo 001. I might even call it. I might even throw in, if I wanted to get really fancy, my subscription name.
So I did find a place, segue, where that naming convention breaks down.
Okay,
And
interesting. And I'll just say
that
subname here.
and
Uh,
that is with real quick Elastic pools with Azure SQL Database and failover groups.
oh, because the failover groups share the same network or something?
No, the if you follow that naming convention, the
Hmm.
Elastic pool has to be named the same on the primary and the secondary. So, but you don't. The failover group can't be in the same region.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so a
Wait.
couple of things here. We can encrypt our virtual network traffic. That's something to keep in mind. This is relatively new. Normally, traffic between your virtual networks is unencrypted. Azure Bastion's another service that lets you connect to VMs through a browser, much better than putting 3389 open to the internet. We'll talk through that in another session. We're not going to do Azure Firewall here because I'm trying to keep our spend down. Uh, Azure Firewall is pretty expensive. On the low end, it's relatively cheap, but here's where we're defining our address space, and you'll notice by default it's gonna go to a /16, which is gonna be a lot of IP addresses. So I'm gonna make this. I'm not gonna make it super small, but I'm gonna make it a 20. Let's make it a 22. I'm not good at IP address math either.
I'm not either.
Yeah, we can then build out a couple of subnets. So here I can change the name of this default subnet to, let's say, SQL, and that's going to have 24 addresses. Private subnet is something new. Starting in 2025, Azure is not going to have outbound traffic by default, and you're going to have a NAT gateway. We'll talk another gateway. We'll talk more about that later.
Bingo.
Yeah, yeah, gateway bingo. And let's add one more subnet for, we'll call it ADDS, so domain controllers.
And while you're doing that real quick, I wanted to point out that unless you, and we'll get into it probably later with private endpoints, but some traffic will actually go outside your network on the Microsoft backbone to like Azure services like Blob Storage or Azure SQL Database,
Mhm.
depending on what service you are doing. So as you get into the VNet stuff, you need to understand what is talking inside your VNet and what's not.
Right, and that's going to be an important concept. So
Yep.
just to refresh, we're doing a VNet East US subname, which because I don't remember my subscription name. Demo is our function there, and then 001. Our address space is 10.0.0/22, so we have 1,024 addresses, and we have two subnets with 256 addresses each. One other thing to remember is that Azure captures the first two and last IPs of each octet. So 10.0.0, 10.0.1, and then 10.0.0.0.256 are all going to be captured by Azure. So you're not going to have those available. So it's important to keep that in planning.
You did not tag your VNet.
I did not tag my VNet. I'm a bad Azure architect.
Tagging
Uh,
people, tagging. Tag your
I, I,
resources in Azure.
I did put it into a specific resource group though, so that's good. Virtual
Yes.
networks create very quickly. As you can see, this demo is now complete. So that's like kind of our overview of networking. Let me go back to PowerPoint because I had a couple of things, and these are some key concepts that I want you to take away from this. A virtual network can only exist in one region and one subscription. That's something to keep in mind. You can't peer networks with overlapping IP address space. And by default, cross VNet traffic across peered VNets is allowed. It's not blocked. Anything else you want to add there?
I don't think so.
I do want to show you one more thing in the portal before we go away, though, because these tools that I have, I had the screen saved, are really important once you get into complex networking architectures, specifically IP flow verify, next hop, and VPN troubleshoot. They used to be under the virtual network that you created. Microsoft has hidden them here under this Network Watcher page. And Network Watcher is this background service that gets created whenever you create a VNet in a region. So just know you'll see these resources in your subscription, and they may or may not make sense. But these tools are really important, and we'll come back to them later in a different session where once we have a little bit more complex network built out. and we can
I use
troubleshoot that.
IP flow verify all the time.
Yeah, basically, especially when I had a customer where they used a lot of third-party stuff, and getting with that private link stuff, getting the network, the IP routing correct can be a nightmare, especially when you're dealing with third-party stuff as well as DNS.
Yep. It's always DNS.
It's always DNS, and that's going to be the subject of probably. We're
Most
going
of
to say
ours.
it's always DNS a lot.
Yep.
So that's about all we have. We're about to wrap up here. Anything else you want to add, John?
Nope. I'm good.
Okay, cool. Well, stay tuned to the series, like and subscribe, and I'll put this all into a playlist so that all these networking topics are gonna be in one playlist. And like I said, it's gonna be around 10 parts. It may be a little bit more. By the time we're all said and done, we'll probably have a couple of special guests. And thank you for joining.
Thanks. See you next time. Happy networking.